Alright, hey guys, it's Baha. We're back with another Leetcode problem. This is top interview questions. Medium set, question number 2 in arrays and strings, which is set matrix 0. So the problem is, given an n by n matrix, if an element is 0, set the entire row and column to 0. And we'll look at what do it in place means a little bit later on. So over here, since this was 0, it set the second row which it was in and the second column which it was in all to zeros. Same thing over here, set it all to zeros. So let's look at the problem. I'm going to be using a variation where I added 0 in here to cover all the cases to look at. So let's look at the problem here. So given this array, a simple solution that first comes to mind is to use maybe a list and store which rows and which columns have zeros, and then do another pass to the array and set those rows and columns to 0. But they specifically stated that they want to do it in place, meaning that they don't use any additional, that they don't make a copy of the array or use any additional space. They use the array itself. So in this first idea, you're storing the rows and columns in a separate list. But when you think about it, doing it in place, you can just store the rows and columns that you have to set to 0 in the actual array itself. So in this example, this is not it's not the output actually. This is just the input. So ideally, this whole row would be 0. This column would be 0. This column would be 0, and this row would be 0. So the idea is to do a first pass of the array, and basically you store which rows and which columns are 0 in the first row and the first column. Because the first row and first column will always exist. It could be the last row, last column. You could do that too, but we'll just do it this way. And you want to check before that if the first row has a 0, because that will be all set to zeros, and if the first column has a 0, because that will be all set to 0 as well. So over here we see a 0. We see that the first row has a 0, and we see that the first column also has a 0. So that was with the first pass of the first row, first pass of the first column. So we know we want to set all of these to 0, but we want to do this at the end, because if we set all of this to 0, then we did another pass of the array, then we set all these columns to 0, which would be incorrect, right? So then we iterate through the rest of the array over here. We find it 0, so we set its row to 0 and its column to 0. So it sets row to 0, sets column to 0, which is in the first row, first column. And then in the next pass of the array, so if we want to ignore first off the 0, 0 position, because if we set this row to 0 and this column to 0, once again it will affect it. So you want to go through the rest of the values. So the rest of the values in the first row and the rest of the values in the first column. So if you see a 0 here, set that whole column to 0. If you see a 0 here, set the whole column to 0, column or row, whichever it is. And then we know that the first row has a 0 and the first column has a 0. So you want to set these all to 0 as well. And that will give you the correct output array. Yeah, that's all there is to it. Ideally, you want this first row and first column variable to be a Boolean, because it'll just tell you if the first row has 0. So has 0, first column has 0, and these are both Booleans. So from this, let's start coding up the solution. Okay, so first thing we want to do, zoom up. All right. First thing is you want to go have a variable, so a Boolean for the first row as 0. It's kind of long, but it's better to have nicely named variables. First column 0. So alright, that's fine. And you want to iterate through the n by n matrix. So for let me explain the time complexity as well. The first one had time complexity of O(n) by n, because you go through the matrix twice, and a space complexity of O(n) by n in the worst case, because what if all of them are zeros and you have to store all of those zeros, which are like 4 by 3, so 12. The second one, since it's in place, this is the most important, the space complexity is O(1). The space doesn't depend on how big the matrix is. And the time complexity is still O n by n because we're going through the matrix multiple times, or even once, but multiple times is affected. So for int row is equal to 0, row is less than matrix dot length row plus plus, and second for loop for the column. For int 0 column is less than matrix. We do this matrix is 0. And if we're doing this, then we have to do an if case. If matrix dot length is double equal to 0, then return matrix. We don't have to do anything on that. Okay, so if r is double equal to 0, so you're in the first row, and matrix of that row double equal to row and column double equal to 0, then you want to have first row has 0 is equal to true, and same thing for the column. The first column is equal to 0, and this is just column 0. Okay, that's done. Now we want to iterate through everything excluding the first row and first column to see if, oh wait, no, we have to do an if case. Otherwise, apart from these two cases. So if matrix row column is double equal to 0, this is where we set like the top and the leftmost, the first row and first column equal to 0. We could just write row is not equal to 0 and column is not equal to 0, and matrix row column is equal to 0. Then you want to set the matrix. First you want to set the, it doesn't really matter the order, but you can set this equal to 0. So at that column, the first index should be 0, and matrix row 0. So at that row, the first element should also be 0. This is for the column, that one was for the row. Because first row, that item. So, and this one is that row, first item. And that's the first pass of the array. We want to do one more pass of the array, and that's just to finish up the array and set everything to 0. Let me scroll down. So we just copied this code here. But this time we only have to iterate through the first row, and yeah, so we only have to iterate through the first row, which contains which rows are 0, and the first column. My mistake. So if row is equal to 1, because we don't want to do the 0, 0 index, because it'll set the whole row and whole column to 0 if it's equal to 0, like we've shown in the example. So for row int r is equal to 1, r is just matrix dot length if matrix row 0 double equal to 0, then do another for loop for int I is equal to 0, I is less than, actually let's do column equal to 0, for int I is equal to 0, I is less than matrix length I plus column plus plus. So you want to set that, if that row first element has 0, you want to set that whole thing to zeros. That's what we're just doing here. Shoot. Matrix row column equal to 0. And same thing for the columns. So this has to be column here. So imagine this for this for loop. We're looking at the top row, and if you see an element that's 0, you want to go down and set those all to 0s. So the column stays the same and the row iterates through. To 0, great. And the last thing we want to do is we want to go through the first row and first column and check if there's any 0s. Oh, but we already have the variables. If first row has 0, if first column has 0. So if first row has 0, then you can set those all to 0s. And same thing for the first column. Get the semicolon. Cool. So you guys have a better view. And this has a void return type because where Java is passed by reference for matrices. So everything we do to this matrix is getting changed in the function call as well. It's persisting. The change is persisting. Yeah, it looks good. Let's run it and see how it goes. Oh yeah. So there's no return type. It's void. So just leave that there. Return. Now run code. There's some typos. Yeah, right there. Great, that seems to be working. Let's submit it. Hopefully it's all good. And we're good. Let's look at more details. Yeah, you guys can see that's accepted. All right, well, thanks for watching. Code is always in the description. Let me know if you guys have any suggestions or if you want any specific videos. You guys pretty good runtime. This is the most optimal solution. O of n by n in place, so no extra memory. Well, constant memory, O1. If you guys don't understand something, just let me know in the comments. The code is always in the GitHub link in the bio, in the description. And thanks for watching. Peace.